Tonight is the 3rd of April. I was converted 48 years ago on the 3rd of April 1977. Now, I was born in Cape Town, but I was born again in Cape Town, but I was raised in Rhodesia in between that time. And I must say, very affectionate memories of life under the green and white in Rhodesia. And our crest of Rhodesia, you can see the gold pick in the middle because it was founded on gold mining, or mining was the main goal. It was the British South Africa company that went in with prospects of hoping to find another Kimberley or another Johannesburg north of the border, north of Limpopo. You can see the sable antelopes. We've got a sable antelope horn here as well. Those were the national buck of Rhodesia. Very strong horn. They could take their horn straight through the side of an average vehicle. Quite powerful, very sharp. And you've got the Zimbabwe bird, the famous Zimbabwe bird from Zimbabwe ruins. You've got the Proteus, the knight's helmet, and you've got the dragon of Wales, the Proteus, of course the gold pick on a green background, and may you be worthy of the name is the title. Now, Rhodesia was a very advanced country, but it was quite extraordinary that this was a privately owned country in many ways. The British South Africa company was basically Cecil Rhodes' private company. It's sort of like, he is almost like the Donald Trump of that time, that he could literally buy his own country, have his own army. The British government didn't put a penny or a pound into Rhodesia before they betrayed it, because Rhodesia was self-supporting, self-governing, self-protecting from its inception. Cecil Rhodes' private army, the British South Africa Police, went north. They made their negotiations. They built these magnificent bridges. And this is World's View, which is where Cecil Rhodes is buried, up in the Matopos. And for many years, for a century, there were guards of honor, warriors from the Madibili tribes that stood guard there to ensure everyone respected his grave. And when Mugabe wanted to remove the grave, the local chief said, under no circumstances, he's one of our chiefs. And so they liked Cecil Rhodes. He's respected there. There was no Rhodes must fall movement in Madibili land, that's for sure. Of course, Zimbabwe ruins defines the whole identity of Rhodesia to a large extent. This points to a previous ancient civilization, possibly from the Arabian Peninsula, that found similar chevrons in Yemen today, and the similar kinds of birds to what you see in the Zimbabwe bird. So it could have been Queen of Sheba if she was in the southernmost point of the Arabian Peninsula. The Queen of Sheba might have had mines in Zimbabwe, what was then called Monomotapa. Fascinating to go there. And myself as a 12-year-old, at one of my most enjoyable activities, we were sent down to Fort Victoria as part of our schooling for a survival camp, bush camp, entrusted to the game rangers. And aside from exploring Zimbabwe ruins, which is really going back into the mines of King Solomon's mines, and which is probably Queen of Sheba's mines, but still. At this stage, we were living amongst wildlife of great numbers. I remember as a young boy of 12, putting on my sheath knife, my water bottle, my bush hat, and going out on a Saturday morning, determined to get to Kami ruins. Now, Kami ruins was similar to Zimbabwe ruins, but it was much closer to Bulawayo. I checked on a map a while ago. It was 14 miles, about 20 kilometers. And I walked there and back on a Saturday without my parents even knowing. And they didn't care. You just had to be home by dark. If the sun went down and the streetlights came on, you should be home. But aside from that, these days, I think parents are struggling to get children to go outside. In my days, the parents were struggling to get us to come indoors. You know, come home, come inside, sit down, have some supper. Well, that was a problem for that time, how to get the kids indoors. Now I think your problem is how to get the kids outdoors. And Kami ruins was fascinating, interesting. And on the way walking there, I saw all kinds of wildlife, including bush pigs, wildebeest, buffalo, zebra, giraffes, not in the game reserve, just outside the city limits. You had wildlife plentiful, just as you went outside the city limits. And interestingly, you would see evidence of Christian graves and symbols like this out in the wild in Rhodesia too. I think these could be the Zionist Christian churches chiseling these kind of crosses on rocks. Of course, we all loved swimming in dams. And so as a youngster, I'd swim in these dams, and you know that the water's stagnant and you'll probably get bilharzia, but it didn't stop us. So when we got back from holidays, we'd all be lined up at school, tested for bilharzia. It was just automatic. Every new school term, you'd get tested for bilharzia, and a lot of us would have it. Then you get treated, and it never stopped us doing any of these silly, dangerous things. We got sleeping sickness, we got stung by tsetse flies, we got malaria, of course. And one thing we got that was quite unique to Rhodesia was putsy flies. If you didn't iron all your clothes, especially underwear, and your sheets and pillowcases, you'd get putsy flies who dig into your skin. They like to lay their eggs on warm, damp linen. I don't think we've ever had that problem in South Africa, except maybe in the very northern Transvaal, maybe. But that was standard in Rhodesia. You had to iron vigorously. Everything, or you would get putsy fly. But none of this stopped us going into outdoors and enjoying the wildlife. And when you talk about wildlife, anyone know what the Rhodesian name is for these chaps? Flat dogs, correct. A flat dog is what we call them. The other name was mobile handbags. Yeah, I know, shame, but you didn't want to get into an argument with a croc. Crocodiles were everywhere, they were plentiful. I met people and know people who had been taken by crocs underwater, even taken to their stash. Under the banks, they might go under the water, and they've got a bit of a cave which is only accessible from the waterside, and then they stash this. So this game ranger got grabbed by a crocodile, taken under the water. What the crocs do is they roll around until you've drowned. So he stopped moving early. When he stopped moving, the croc assumed he was dead, stashed him in his food pile amongst all kinds of decomposing corpses and buffalo horns and what have you. And there he was, able to then dig out through the thin surface of the, which was basically a mud cave. So he got out and he survived. And met people who had missing an arm, missing a leg, and they'd been grabbed by a croc, played dead, were able to crawl away later. So interesting, if you see these eyes at night, it's a little intimidating. I've actually stepped on a crocodile before, thinking as a log. And for being unobservant, suddenly had a very moving experience, which is quite terrifying. And before you know it, you can do athletic achievements you could never do normally. But growing up, my ambition and dream was to be a game ranger. Just loved the idea of protecting animals, shooting poachers, that sort of thing, being in nature. My father was in the Royal Artillery. He served all 6 years of the Second World War, serving in Northern Desert Army, 8th Army it became later, under Field Marshal Montgomery. Here he is in Cairo, and behind him, interestingly, is Gone with the Wind. This picture's so faded you can't read it now. They're advertising Gone with the Wind at the cinema downtown. That was the era. 1940 in Egypt. And as he said, the real enemy in desert was not the Afrika Korps, it was the desert. And he said, we felt more close to our enemy, the Afrika Korps, than we did to our family back home. Because he said, they endured what we endured. Dust storms, lice, sand flies, all of the rest. Sunstroke, unbelievable heat, ulcers, all kinds of not just sunburn and heat stroke, fevers and so on. And when this is coming, you're in trouble. So he said, we were having a better relationship with our enemy, who were enduring the same enemy of the desert, than we were having with our family and friends back home, who we thought they can't understand. They're not going through this. They don't understand the value of water. They don't understand what it's like to be in the shade. They don't appreciate what it's like to be in desert heat. And one of the things my dad said that they would do is if they wanted to cook an egg, just cleaned parts of an armored car or tank or the artillery piece, cracked the egg over it and it would sizzle just on the metal in the sun. That was enough to cook an egg perfectly. You didn't need to make a fire. Well, North African desert was a rough place to fight, but it was mainly because of the terrain. But they said that they respected the enemy so well. There were all kinds of truces, spontaneous truce on the ground after battle. There would be medics from both sides caring for wounded of both sides. And I've read this also from pilots, if you shot down an enemy pilot and he went down in a place that was very deserted, they would often radio signal back to the enemy where they could find their pilot, because they know you couldn't survive long in those conditions. And there were other pilots dropping their supplies and water bottles to the pilot that just shot down, because they knew he had little time to live if he didn't get water and other important supplies. So there was this constant concern for the enemy. Now, my father was operating these 25-pounders. That was his main. So this is my family's traditional weapon. When I speak about you should be allowed to travel with your traditional weapons, well, a 25-pounder is our traditional weapon. Took my son to the War Museum in Rosebank to see his traditional weapon of his grandfather. And Field Marshal Montgomery, interestingly, who is my father's officer commanding for most of the war, he had next to his bed, my dad said, a framed picture of Erwin Rommel, the enemy commander. And this is just a strange comment, but my father mentioned it. And, you sort of walk around with this funny, weird comment in your head. And in 2014, I was invited to England for the 100th anniversary of the First World War breaking out. And of course, I had to go to the Imperial War Museum. So I go to the Imperial War Museum, and what do I see? They've got a massive exhibit to the First World War on the ground floor, as you'd expect. Second floor, they've got Second World War exhibits, and they just happen to have a reconstruction of the 8th Army Commander's tent of Field Marshal Montgomery. And would you believe it, there's a picture of Erwin Rommel on the bedside stand next to the bed of Field Marshal Montgomery. Intriguing. And his logic was just like General Patton, who said he always kept a copy of Rommel's book, Infantry Attacks and Tank Attacks, on his bedside. It was a nighttime reading. He said Rommel was the best, and he's the gold standard. We need to learn from him. And so that's interesting. Now, Montgomery, interestingly, became a great friend of South Africa because of the fact that some of his best soldiers in the Second World War were South Africans and Rhodesians. So here he is visiting Rhodesia after the war. He became a major defender of South African Rhodesia when Britain was putting sanctions on us. Montgomery was saying, these people fought for us and they were some of our best men. They sacrificed for the British Empire. How dare we abandon them now that they're being targeted by the Soviets? So interesting, he was loyal to his old men. Now, my mother was brought up in Berlin. She was bombed by the enemy. She was experiencing 1,000 bomber raids from the time she was a little girl. From age 6 to age 11, she experienced regular bombings, seeing her suburb and neighborhood turned into a pile of ashes and wreckage, burning bodies, all sorts of things, coming out of a bomb shelter and experiencing all the horrors of war as a young little girl already. I mean, absolutely shocking. But she decided to become a nurse and ended up meeting my dad when my father came back from Rhodesia to see his father in hospital where his father was dying. And he met this nurse, and obviously my father must have really liked nurses because his first wife was a nurse as well, my sister Vanessa's mom, but she passed away from an epileptic seizure where she smothered herself with her own pillow accidentally. And so my poor sister came home to that. So my dad married 2 nurses in succession, one Afrikaans, the other German. So he obviously didn't go for the English girls. In fact, my father even said to me, never marry an English girl. I'm like, yeah, why is that? Well, I don't know what his reason was, but he obviously liked Afrikaans and German nurses. And once I remember coming home with a girlfriend, I'd been on dates, and she was in his nurse's uniform. My dad catapulted out of his chair and was so alert, it was, gee, he really likes nurses in uniform. But anyway, so my mother's father was in the Afrika Korps. And this is interesting because that meant my father and my grandfather fought one another in the Second World War. So at one point we heard, Granddad's going to visit. Or actually Opa. But I was a bit concerned about this, as a young boy of 5, I remember hearing, Dad and Granddad are going to meet, and he thought, are they going to be fighting in, is there going to be trenches in the yard? Are we going to have fighting in the living room? We didn't know what to expect, and I was so amazed because my father never showed emotion. I mean, cool, calm, and collected, typical Brit. There was no emotion. I never saw my father cry except if one of our cats died. And there was no emotion. I never heard my father say something like, I love you, or I'm proud of you, my son, until the week before he died. But when my grandfather came, we saw my father emotional. He hugged this man. It's like brothers. Absolutely amazing. He would look at films. When they showed Hollywood films, he'd say, it wasn't like that. What that? None of it was like that at all. I don't believe that. Watching a film. So what do you mean you don't believe that? What? All these atrocity stories says the Germans were honorable people, an honorable enemy. The Afrika Korps were gentlemen. And so my dad, like many military veterans I've met, moths and so on, didn't believe the wartime propaganda, didn't believe the post-war films, and because they'd met the enemy. They'd sung Christmas carols to one another on Christmas Eve and Christmas Day, played football together on Christmas Day, swapped ration packs. Not just First World War, it's happened in the Second World War too in North Africa. So my poor mom, she lost her dad for most of the war. She didn't see him for the whole of the war, all 6 years. But I've got Afrika Korps cap to commemorate my grandfather there, along with the 8th Army helmet of my dad. Well, 8th Army and Afrika Korps were such good friends. Do you know that the son of Erwin Rommel and the son of Field Marshal Montgomery became best friends, and their families would have family holidays together? Absolutely amazing, because Erwin Rommel was the best. He was such a gentleman. You've probably seen these pictures before of Erwin Rommel with those goggles on his officer's cap. What most people don't realize is those goggles are South African Army issue. German Army didn't issue those kind of goggles. And so there's a story behind it, which I only heard a few years ago at a MOSS meeting. That's Memorial Order of the Tin Hat. So there was a lady, I was going to say young lady, but I suppose she wasn't that young, but she was talking about her dad, who was a South African Army general, who was captured at Tobruk. So her father was invited by Erwin Rommel to come to officers' tent for supper that night, which was normal. Erwin Rommel would always have the captured officers joining him in his mess tent. And the Field Marshal asked, "Where's your hat?" And the South African general, I'm sorry, I've just forgotten his name right now. The South African general said, "One of your officers took it for a souvenir." Well, Erwin Rommel scowled and barked out some orders, and a few minutes later, some officer came running up, came to attention, saluted, and handed over this hat back to the South African general. And the general was so impressed in this that he had nothing really to give Erwin Rommel except his goggles. So he gave him the South African issue goggles for, desert storms. And so Erwin Rommel wore these South African goggles for the rest of his career, throughout the rest of the war. And every picture you see, I'd never noticed before, those aren't German issue goggles. They're South African issue goggles. So he was wearing something to honor South Africa for the rest of his career, which I think is quite amazing. Here's my dad meeting my grandfather, my opa, and I'm this little one here because I'm the baby of the family. My one sister's 17 years older than me, my other sister's 10 years older than me, my brother's 5 years older than me. I'm the Lord Lomaki. And as you can see, no hostility. And this is something that struck me, and this is one reason why I got interested in history. I want to know, why was my father and my mother on opposite sides? Why was my opa and my dad fighting one another? And I wanted to know, because my father didn't believe any of the normal propaganda they were giving. And I met people in Rhodesia who fought in the Second World War who also were quite derogatory about the movies and saying, this is lies and propaganda and nonsense. And so my great-grandfather served in the Kaiser's army. Here he is with Field Marshal van Hindenburg, and my great-grandfather at the Battle of Tannenberg in Rusland. Another Uncle Gert fought in the Wehrmacht. I had an Uncle Wolf who was in the Luftwaffe, who fought all the way over in Russia and spent 10 years in a gulag, in a concentration camp as a prisoner slave of Stalin. And when he came back, he'd lost his left hand to gangrene and frostbite. So a bit scary for a youngster to see that his one uncle's missing a hand, and yet he's the most cheerful of them all. Another uncle was Captain Ernst Lindemann of the Bismarck, went down with the Bismarck, and another was the medical officer of Graf Spee, interned in Paraguay during the war. So we have quite a collection of military relations who were involved in all different sides, and my brother was in the Rhodesian Army, I was in the South African Army, and so we've had Hammonds in uniform all the way back to the Napoleonic Wars and the Battle of Waterloo. I might say Lindemans as well. I remember being so impressed to see Victoria Falls, just staggered and stunned and fascinated. At age 12, I got my first glimpse of this, one of the 7 natural wonders of the world. Forever linked with David Livingstone. My father was the catering manager at the Victoria Falls Hotel immediately after the war. So he is just 16 months out of uniform, and he had to cater for the royal family at Victoria Falls Hotel. The whole royal family from King George VI, Princess Margaret, Princess Elizabeth, who later became the Queen, came. My father said this was more terrifying than being bombed by the Afrika Korps. And I think when I saw the Downton Abbey film of catering for the royal family, I came to grasp something, because my father was quite a royalist, and he was so intimidated to have this task, greatest honor of my life, kind of comments and so on. You can't understand the royal family and the affection for it from the average citizens until you see something like that. Even in Zambia in 2011, I saw the whole country come to a standstill to watch the royal wedding of William and Catherine. Absolutely staggering. Even Zambia, the old Northern Rhodesia, they were fascinated with the royal family. And just, there's this affection. I was very surprised. So King George VI came, visited Rhodesia, and the Rhodesian Prime Minister when I was growing up was a veteran of the Second World War as well, Ian Douglas Smith, who's visited Livingston House as well. I've interviewed him on radio. He flew in Hurricanes and Spitfires, was shot down twice. In fact, a lot of his face is plastic surgery. His back was seriously damaged in his being shot down in North Africa. As he said, they thought his back was broken, but actually it was only buckled. And later he was in after North Africa, he was fighting in Italy, strafed a train, came back for a second run, which he said was a bad move, and they shot him down then. Now, if you're in a Spitfire and you're shot down, there's no ejector seats in those days. The only way to get out was to go a bit higher, so you've got some clearance for parachute, turn upside down, jettison your canopy, unbuckle your seatbelt upside down, so you fall out upside down. And when you clear, you pull your ripcord, and you can't practice for that. And you think how easy it is today when you've got the ejector seats. So you needed nerves of steel to be able to get out of the plane. It's going far too fast for you to climb out the plane. The only way is to flip upside down and fall upside down, as he was saying. So that was extraordinary experience. Ian Smith was a real hero to us growing up, and I remember being super impressed with meeting him as a young boy. I was only about 14 when I first met Ian Smith. He was coming to the Bulawayo Club, and so I expected some entourage, perhaps something like the Coldstream Guards outside Buckingham Palace, something like that. This is the leader of our country in a time of war. Certainly there'll be some security. So I went to watch, and down the road comes this very humble man driving his own Peugeot 404, white Peugeot 404, battered kind of vehicle, comes to a stop, gets out, no driver, no aide-de-camp, no bodyguard, no policeman in sight. He stroked my cat Tim that was sitting on the wall, smiled at me, walked up the stairs into Bulawayo Club, and I'm looking around, where's the entourage, where's the security? And I met some people who claimed to be the bodyguards of Ian Smith, but I'm not too sure how true that is, because he never had a bodyguard. He would often even kick the guards away from the gate, and there wasn't a cook in the kitchen, nobody in Independence, because he said, I can't be bothered with these people fussing around me. And he didn't bother with security. maybe there was some security at some state events, but for normal time, he would ignore his own country's rules. He would just drive to his farm at Selukwe without going in a convoy, which was the law at the time. He'd break his own country's laws because he couldn't bear having people fussing around him. When I got to meet him, there was never security around, and his front door would be open. There'd be a Rhodesian Ridgeback dog lying over the door, and that would be it. The front gates would be wide open. Front door open. I mean, there's no security whatsoever. When I questioned him about this for a radio program, Ian Smith said, I'm a lifelong Presbyterian. I survived the Second World War. What do I have to fear? What can it do to me? And he feared God alone. And it was magnificent to grow up in a country like Rhodesia, clean, neat, efficient. I think we were safer in Rhodesia during the war than we are in Cape Town during peace. And the green and white being raised, 1968 we went from being a constitutional monarchy to being an independent republic, and the green and white flag replaced the old blue flag that you see downstairs in reception, which had the British Union Jack in the corner. I walk down this road to school every day. This is Selborne Avenue and to Milton High School, and be popping these jacaranda bulbs on the ground the whole way along, walking in the shade. Absolutely magnificent that our streets were literally covered by jacarandas. It was like walking on a carpet. And the fountains in what used to be wilderness, extraordinary. And this is what it's like walking on a carpet of jacaranda bulbs. The hotels my dad ran normally employed warthogs. The warthogs were like the gardeners. They would trim the grass perfectly. They wouldn't dig up the roots, they'd just trim the grass. So you'd have these warthogs on their knees trimming the grass, so they were employees of the hotels. Very effective. I wouldn't mind having some warthogs trimming our lawn on normal states as well. So this is an occasion of going to visit Victoria Falls. I would have been 12 years old here. That's the bush hat we had to wear all the time we were outside. I never could tan, I could only sunburn. So going anywhere meant you took your bush hat, you took your water bottle, you took your bush knife. That was just essentials every boy thought of. You can see I'm really the youngster here. And as a naughty boy, I enjoyed finding these chameleons because I learned that the local people were terrified of chameleons. They were superstitious. As a chameleon can change colors and look in different directions at the same time. So I was quite naughty. I'd find a chameleon and I'd walk up to some Madabili man and say, have you seen my chameleon? Just to see an adult scream and run away. It was very delightful to a naughty boy. And I mentioned this once at home, foolishly. Next thing I discovered my younger son was doing that. He was finding chameleons in our gardens and going out to find some poor person to terrify. This is uniquely Rhodesian. Strip roads. Country was too sparsely populated to afford full roads, so you just have a thin strip of tar, 2 strips, and when you saw an oncoming vehicle, you'd have to move your left tires off, and your right tires could have 1 lane, and then the opposite side would do the same. You'd drive past waving furiously, very exciting to see another car. You could go for hours sometimes without seeing another vehicle. It was a very sparsely occupied country, but if you had a problem and you, say, broke down, maybe you had your second puncture, people, strangers would lend you their spare tire. There were no strangers in the country. Everyone had this very nice sense of caring for you, and what we don't forget is the first rule of the road. Elephants have right of way. And they kept teaching us this, and you do see elephants, not just signs, and I don't know about you, but I would never argue with an elephant. I think that elephants should always have rights of way. You don't see big tuskers like this these days. This is what we did when I was growing up. These big tuskers, unfortunately, are targets for these horrible poachers because some people in the Middle East want to have ivory. The only animals who need ivory is an elephant. No people need ivory. And here, watch out for elephants and watch out for hippos. Now, hippos kill a lot more people in Africa every year than crocodiles. Hippos are super dangerous. They don't like you coming in the water with them. it's their water, you're an intruder, and they will crunch up your boat very quickly if you don't like you. By the way, that is a warthog in this 5-meter crocodile's mouth. And this crocodile is big. Now, I've gone swimming in rivers that have got these crocodiles in there. At one point, I was told there's no crocodiles in the river here at all, and I went swimming with my young son to be told later, are you crazy? There's a 5-meter crocodile out there. And so, fortunately, we didn't meet him that time. But you don't want to argue with crocodiles either. So this is me as a youngster, always seen with some kind of fluffy animal. And a bush baby was one of my pets when I was younger. And I also had a lioness, Vivian, as a pet when I was growing up. Vivian was an inseparable friend. There was even an article in the newspaper about this little boy who lives in a world of lions. And that's my Vivian. And Malcolm was a friend because some foolish people tried to mate this lion with this leopard. They wanted some leopard. And, well, Vivian was not impressed. And the poor leopard got such a smack across his face every time he tried to get friendly. And it seems that they are not interested in these experiments and wasn't going to transition or anything like this. So it didn't matter what they told her. Vivian had her own mind. And ultimately, I lost my lioness to Joburg Zoo, which was a bit sad. But neighbors got terrified because they were afraid that their poodle was going to end up as breakfast. And the little lions do grow. So the story here is, my father, being a hotel manager, came home one day with a lioness. It was called Dingaka. There was Juliet Prowse, some English actress, who was out for a film called Dingaka, filmed in South Africa. At the end, they gave her this lioness as a pet. And for whatever reason, she gave it to the hotel manager, my dad. And I think maybe she couldn't get the paperwork, maybe she didn't want a lion, but my father knew that his youngest was obsessed with lions. So can you imagine a dream come true, you're a little boy and you get a lioness as a pet one night? So that was amazing. And Vivian and I were inseparable. But when they moved to Joburg Zoo, I got visitation rights. And she actually had her own enclosure, which had a waterfall and a pride rock and some trees and so on. And she got her own family. And even when she had her cubs and her husband, I presume, down the road there, I was able to go into the enclosure because she'd remember me. And there was no danger, problem. I remember very proudly remembering once some little boy shouting, "Mommy, Mommy, come see, the lion's eating a little boy." And she was just licking me, but you know, growing up with a lion spoils you because lions are the best of friends possible. If they regard you as part of their pride, you are set. They will protect you. And that's the thing. Lions are extremely gregarious, affectionate creatures. And as for leopards, well, if you've seen a cheetah is about 45 to 55 kgs. A leopard's 120 kgs. So a leopard is twice the weight of a cheetah. Cheetahs are built for speed. Leopards are built for strength and stealth. A lion is double the weight of a leopard. So a lion is about 240 kilograms. So a leopard's got no chance against a lion. And by the way, a tiger is 350 kgs. Sure. That's 7 times the weight of a cheetah. So just to put the cats into perspective, you know, your cats can be quite intimidating. Caracals are double that size. And then you start all the way up to lions and cheetahs and leopards. Well, by the way, if a tiger fights a lion, the lion will probably still win, despite the tiger being much bigger. Because lions, first of all, tend to work in teams, and they work in prides, live in prides. And a tiger tends to be solitary, so a lion will probably still win. And this is apparently the way I grew up, doing schoolwork with my 4 cats on the table all around me. And that was typical schoolwork for me. I always wanted to reach the standard that my brother was in when there was no homework, because my brother never did homework. But I never reached that standard where you never had homework somehow. Now, Rhodesia was a country at war, and at first it was just Zambia was hot. And then when the Portuguese withdrew, we had more than 50% of our border went hot, with the whole of Mozambique, the old Portuguese East Africa, becoming terrorist attack zone. And Rhodesia had an army which everybody was involved in the army about half the time. So, for example, my brother was a printer. He'd have to spend 6 months in the army, 6 months in his work. If we had a male teacher, he'd only be a teacher for 6 months, another 6 months someone else, because he'd have to be in the army for 6 months of the year. And this was a citizens' army. Everyone was basically half-time civilian, half-time military, except the ones who decided to be full-time military. And the Rhodesian army did some spectacular achievements, and Ian Smith was a leader that everyone respected because he wouldn't be bullied by the Brits, he wouldn't be bullied by the United Nations. He stood firm, and we resisted the communists. And many people think of Ian Smith as running a racist apartheid government. That's garbage. There never was apartheid in Rhodesia. And Ian Smith's goal always was 50-50. And the reason why Rhodesia once ended up with a whites-only government is not because they weren't giving black people a vote and enabled to have members of parliament. It's because the ZANU-ZAPU terrorists tortured, murdered, assassinated anyone who put themselves up as being a candidate. And so black people weren't able to vote, or black candidates couldn't stand because of the terrorists. They targeted them. And so it's not that Rhodesia wasn't trying to have a multiracial government where there was literally 50-50 parity. That was Ian Smith's goal. It was the policy of the terrorists to murder headmen, chiefs, members of parliament, town councillors, and so on. So most people don't know the story of Rhodesia or the real history of what went on there. But Ian Smith was a courageous man, hated by much of the world, but loved by his own people. And he would get mobbed by crowds, and Harari lifted on his shoulder, paraded through town. Mr. Smith, when are you coming back? When are you going to free us from this Mugabe and things like this? Shame. Well, this is the way we knew him later in life when he was visiting Livingston House. We had many a meal and discussions with him. And this is in someone's home nearby in Cape Town, where Lenore and I are meeting with Ian Smith, Harriet Bathman, Bill Bathman's wife. Ian Smith was always a very tall, thin man, and he endured a lot. I mean, imagine getting shot down twice, having half your face built up with plastic surgery. So that's quite an experience. So that was my background, being brought up in Rhodesia. On the 3rd of April, 1977, I was wanting to go to a film, forgetting or not knowing that Cape Town, we didn't have films on Sundays because in South Africa we actually had laws against Sabbath desecration. Sundays were the Lord's Day, day of rest, no cinemas, no shops open anywhere in the country. That was the way it was back in the 70s. So in 1977, I go to the cinema thinking I'm going to see the film that's advertised outside. And I didn't know that the local Baptist church had hijacked the cinema for an evangelistic outreach. And I'm thinking, gee, the people are well dressed. I mean, ladies are wearing hats and gloves and dresses, and everyone is well dressed. And I'm thinking, maybe this is what South Africans do on Sundays. Then I get in the cinema, I'm thinking, wait a minute, why didn't we pay? And they're singing hymns and choruses, and I think, this is strange. But maybe that's what South Africans do on Sundays. Maybe they sing hymns before the cinema. And I'm still expecting the film to come up. So when the evangelist stood up and started to preach the gospel, I thought, I'm ambushed. But the lights are still on. I'm right towards the front, and it's a long way back, and I didn't feel I could move. I was ambushed. So they're preaching the gospel, and I hear the gospel very powerfully from Rex Matthew, the guest speaker. And I would never have gone to a church. Secular family. We never went to church. We never went to Sunday school. We never prayed. We never said grace at meals. I didn't have a Bible or anything like that at home. So I would never have gone to a church any more than you would go to Calvin Grove or one of the snob clubs downtown if you weren't a member. You know, just unthinkable. I think the only way you can reach secular, unchurched people like I was is to go into the world where they are, where they're comfortable. And so I think this church taking over the local cinema for an outreach, we're doing the right thing. And the pastor gave an interesting illustration. He said, has God ever saved your life? If God has saved your life, it's for a reason. Now my mind went back to my mother enduring the bombings in the Second World War, and my mom also saying her first experience of, the first black person she ever saw was a Canadian. who pinned her down in the basement with a bayonet to her throat when the Allies took over the home. And, she could have got killed. She wouldn't tell the man a thing. He wanted to know where the family jewels were. And my mother later went to England, and in fact, they were thrown out of their home by the Canadians who took over their area, because she had started the war in Berlin, but because of all the bombing, all children were evacuated at one point. She was staying with an aunt in Minden, which is close to Bremen in Westphalia, roughly close to where the entire 3 legions were destroyed of the Romans back in the Battle of Teutoburger Forest. So in Minden, the Canadians took over the home and kicked them out in winter into the snow. And so she is pulling a sled with her baby brother on there, bundled up, and at one point looked back and saw her brother was gone, and she had to go back and find her brother, who's now covered in snow, absolutely buried in snow, and rescue him. They were living off food they could get out of the dustbins of the Canadians at their barracks. Normally cucumber sandwich crusts, and the crusts were cut off. And so the destitution that my mother went through there. Later she went to train to be a nurse in England, and while being a nurse, she was awarded a national award by Harold Macmillan, if you can recognize the face here. He's the Winds of Change speech man in England. And anyway, my mother won this award. We've still got those books that she got as a top nurse in Britain. And my mother met my father as a result of of being a nurse. But she, by the way, was taking thalidomide tablets. And thalidomide tablets were the wonder drug that stopped any morning sickness. So abortion was illegal in South Africa, but she was given not just permission to have an abortion, the doctor recommended you must have an abortion, your child will be born deformed. That would be me. Because thalidomide patients were being born without arms, legs, sometimes even without eyes. And so there was this horror, and suddenly South Africa allowed abortions in this exception case because they were so traumatized by these hideous deformities. And so my mother told me about this when I was small, and so I'm thinking about this in the cinema where I'm sitting in Ster-Kinnick Cinema in Pines, 3rd of April 1977. If God has saved your life, it's for a reason. I'm thinking, well, my dad had people being blown up to the left and the right of him. My mom had people in their suburbs being incinerated, and they survived. God must have had a reason, but what reason could it be? And then my mother told me all kinds of stories, not just how I was almost aborted before I was born, but when we were traveling on Pendennis Castle between Europe and South Africa, I came down with some contagious disease, and they wanted to put me off at Madeira Island because you can't have a contagious kid on a ship. And my mother called for a chaplain on board to pray for me, and I was healed. And so I'm remembering all these stories at this time, and why would God have spared my life? I've never so much just thanked him for a single thing. I've never shown any affection for God. Why would he spare my life? And then he gave the story about this Count Nicholas van Zinzendorf, who was in a museum of art where he saw this picture on the wall of Christ being crucified for us, and the slogan said, "This I did for thee, what hast thou done for me?" And as the evangelist said, what have you ever done for Christ? I mean, I sat there and thought, absolutely nothing. I've not so much as given him thanks, not even once, for anything. Not for life, not for health, not even for food, not for sparing my parents' life in the Second World War. I've done nothing for Christ. And then he gave a testimony about how Christ is alive today. And I'd never known that before. I'd gone to a Catholic school, not because my parents were Catholic, but simply for the academics. So I'd heard a whole lot of things. And I knew about the resurrection, but I had no idea he's still alive today. I assumed Jesus rose from the dead, but he died a bit later on, maybe, sort of like Lazarus. So the idea that Jesus Christ is alive today and he's coming again, absolutely amazing. And so the message got through to me, and at the end of the evangelistic rally, Rector Matthew asked for us to commit our life to Christ. And they were singing Just as I Am without one plea, but that their blood was shed for me. I walked to the front, knelt down in the front of the cinema, gave my life to Christ. 3rd of April, 1977. I knew I was a hell-deserving sinner. I felt if I died that night, I would have justly been condemned to hell, and I couldn't have complained about that at all. I knew I was lost. And I didn't understand much more, but I knew that Jesus is the Savior. And He's risen, and He's alive today, and He can communicate to us today. And that night, as I surrendered my life to Christ, I was called to missions. I knew I was called to missions. I knew the rest of my life I've got to spend sharing this gospel. I was only 17 years old, but I'd never heard the gospel before. Now, I must have been exposed to the gospel, even though I was in a secular family, because we had hymn singing at school in Rhodesia. Every morning we'd have some Bible reading and hymn singing, so I must have been exposed to the gospel. I knew those hymns, but I'd never understood one single spiritual concept. I'd sung the words without understanding the message. And so that's a picture of me at 17, roughly about the time that I got converted. And the church, Pioneers Baptist Church, my first church, first Sunday, I got collected to be brought through to Sunday service, which was Resurrection Sunday, interestingly enough. So Pioneers Baptist was a very dynamic church under the leadership of Doc Watson at that time. Rex Matthew had been a pastor years before, but he had been brought in 1977 just to be a guest speaker for that outreach. And here's the guest speaker for that Sunday morning as well. Now, I should mention that a local Christian family, the Leprinis, came to pick me up for Sunday church that Sunday morning. And just as well they did, because I would never have made my way to church on my own. I was still too secular and too afraid. I mean, you know, those churches, it's like you wouldn't wander into a Freemason meeting and join it or something like that. I would never have gone as a secular person into a church. And I think people who think you just put up a few adverts and secular people go and wander into your church, it's not going to happen. I can assure you, a secular person would not go to church. He needs someone to take him. Now, I only needed to be taken the first time. After that, I was hooked. But the first time, and my first experience coming to church, I come into church, and what do? You sit in the back row. And the next thing is, a lady came along and said, "That's my seat." So I moved to the next row. Some other lady came and said, "That's my seat." And I moved a few times down before I found a seat that wasn't booked. I hadn't noticed the names on it, but evidently people have their favorite places. And again, just a bit of a warning, people in church to know that it's not a nice welcome to church to be told that's my seat or my parking bay or whatever it is. But I think that's pretty standard human nature out there. We should be careful. But the first thing I noticed is, I know these hymns. I'd sang the hymns when I was at school in Rhodesia, so I was quite struck by, wow, you know, suddenly, I've maybe sung some of these hymns many a time before, but now for the first time I understood what it was meaning. So I understand what being born again means. I was spiritually deaf, dumb, blind, and dead. I had no understanding of the spiritual things before. To think that a year before I could have sung the same hymn and nothing. Don't understand a thing. Now I'm excited about what I'm singing because it's my experience. It's no longer singing some words on a page. It's singing reality, experience. And that just again showed me what it means to be born again. I was spiritually dead, and God raised me to life, just like He said to Lazarus, "Lazarus, come out." To expect a corpse to come out of a tomb is not reasonable, but that's the power of the Word of God. And I was spiritually dead, deaf, dumb, blind, and God's Word came, and I came to life. So I remember that first night when I went home, and I was asked by my dad, "So I believe you found God?" And without trying to be funny, I responded saying, "No, actually, He found me." Because I understood earlier, right from the beginning, I hadn't chosen God, He had chosen me. I hadn't found God. God wasn't lost. God had found me. I was the one who was lost. And this whole thing of, you found Jesus and you chose God. No, that's not my experience. So I know what it is to be born again because I was spiritually unresponsive, deaf, dumb, blind, and spiritually dead before. But to think, even when I went to Baptist Theological Seminary, many a time, and we'd sing hymns every single day. They'd sometimes say, does anyone know how this hymn goes? Because we'd literally work our way through the hymn book. Every day, just the next one, so on. And sometimes I, the new convert, was the only one who understood how to sing this particular hymn, because I'd sung it at school in Rhodesia many a time, as a pagan maybe, and sometimes for the first time I'm singing it as a Christian, because we went through some very strange hymns at Baptist College, and to think that many times I was the only one who knew it. I knew the tune, but I'd never understood the words, and to sing it with understanding for the first time, absolutely remarkable. So this idea of being born again makes sense to me, because I know that it was like a light was switched on, and I was before that wandering around the dark. Well, one of the sermon illustrations on that first Sunday service I attended, Resurrection Sunday, Rex Matthews says, today in Moscow, there's a line of people, as there always is, lining up outside Lenin's tomb to see their God, Vladimir Lenin, founder of the Soviet Union. And there they are lining up in Red Square because they want to see the tomb of Vladimir Lenin. And there he is, although not really. Mostly what you're seeing is plaster of Paris. They've got a full-time taxidermist trying to keep Lenin looking lifelike. But the fingers fell off, the nose fell off, the ears fell off. So he's mostly plaster of Paris, and like Madame Tussauds waxworks, basically. But nevertheless, there's no doubt that Vladimir Lenin is dead. Now, it so happens that on the other side of Red Square, there's St. Basil's Cathedral, one of the only churches that was allowed to be open in the Soviet Union. They had closed down or destroyed, confiscated 49,000 churches. There were 50,000 churches at the time of the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917 in the old Russia. And by this stage, there was less than 200 left. But St. Basil's was one of them. And so Rex Matthews describing, now in St. Basil's Cathedral on Easter Sunday, they've got a liturgy which includes the pastor saying, where is he? And the congregation says, he's not here. Where is he? He's not here. The third time, where is he? And then the cry goes up, Christ is risen. And the entire congregation resounds, he is risen indeed. And so Rex Matthews says, imagine these poor atheists lining up there, coming to see their dead God, and suddenly hearing this cry from the other end of Red Square at St. Basil's Cathedral. Christ is risen. Christos anviat. Imagine what a contrast this is between the dead religion of communism and the living religion of Jesus Christ. Not religion, relationship. And I never forgot that message. We serve a risen Savior. Death is defeated. Christ has risen, victorious over death, hell, and the grave. Lenin is in his tomb. You can go to Medina and see the grave of Muhammad. You can go to Southeast Asia and see Buddha's grave. You can go up to China and see Confucius's grave. But if you go to Jerusalem, there is an empty tomb. And by the way, they call this tomb Gordon's tomb. Not because Gordon was buried there, but because General Charles Gordon, our Commandant General of the Cape, was kicked out because he is so pro-Zulu and so pro-Boer. The Cape residents couldn't tolerate a Commandant General like that. So he was for a year without a military position. So he went to Palestine and did Bible study and archaeological research around Palestine. This, now we're talking about 1880. And he, by Bible study and archaeological research, General Charles Gordon found what they call now the Garden Tomb and Gordon's Calvary very close by. So why didn't the Catholics find it? Because they didn't do archaeological research or Bible study. They had some monk have a dream and a vision, and this is where Christ died and this is where he was buried, and then they built their chapels and their edifices and put their statues and icons and all that around it. And laid it with so much gold you can't see what it used to look like. But by God's grace, the real places were preserved until General Charles Gordon, an evangelical Bible-believing soldier, he got there, and his book, Reflections on Palestine, he said, was his most treasured work of his life, that he identified the Garden Tomb and where Christ had been buried. Even though he won victories in battle in China, Sudan, he looked at this as his greatest achievement in his life. Interestingly, and that's where Protestants still go to this day. And it's preserved pretty much like it would have been at the time by God's grace, without any superstitious mumbo-jumbo obscuring the venue. And this message, Jesus Christ alive, was so clearly communicated to me on that first Resurrection Sunday service that I attended back in 1977. And I'd somehow missed the fact that Jesus is alive today. Certainly I didn't realize he's coming again to judge the living and dead, or that I can talk to him and listen to him and have a personal relationship with Christ today. So that was a good experience of a church service, that we've got a powerful resurrection faith. So Easter for me has always been special. By the way, I was born again on Easter 1977. I crossed the border on my first mission across the border into communist Mozambique on Easter 1982. I got married in Easter 1989. Easter's always been a very important time in our life, and I think it's so important for us to make the most of our Christian calendar. My pastor, Doc Watson, was a chartered accountant. He had served in the Second World War too. He had been a missionary in Scripture Union. And one of the first things I experienced in church was he started to go through Pilgrim's Progress every Sunday morning, expanding Pilgrim's Progress, going line by line, verse by verse through it. And I never forgot that. Pilgrim's Progress made such a big impact on my life. And I praise God for Doc Watson. He became the first chairman of the board of Frontline Fellowship. And we had him for 14 years as our chairman. Absolutely invaluable early pioneer of our mission, helping guide me as a very irresponsible, reckless youngster. And Pilgrim's Progress made a big impact. Because he was from Scripture Union, he directed me there, and I got involved in my first ministry. Was just up the road here, Scripture Union, number 14. Interesting, they're number 14, that's 2 sevens, and we're 28, 4 sevens. And Scripture Union Bookshop was the first job I had outside of school. And the camps and holiday camps and outreaches I was running in Somerset West as a brand new Christian, only a few months old in the Lord. And I preached my first service there in the Presbyterian Church in Somerset West. And we had a holiday mission in the Methodist Church in Somerset West. And then at Plumstead, I did another holiday mission. Scripture Union was phenomenal. What I liked was their principle, Bible before breakfast. They taught us how to have quiet times. And I think a quiet time, or a QT, is something that's been lost in many modern Christians' experiences. But at least as a brand new Christian, I was into the Bible comes before breakfast. Start your day with the Scriptures. Absolutely, give God the best time of the day. The next excellent step I made was I joined in an evangelism explosion training program. Long before I ever met James Kennedy personally and preached from his pulpit, I saw his film in black and white, Like a Mighty Army, giving the vision of evangelism explosion. That he pointed out that if Billy Graham filled an evangelistic crusade stadium every single day of the year for so many years, he would win less people to Christ than if you're involved in a ministry of multiplication. And he starts off with, if you win 2 people to Christ in this year and train them to be evangelists, to win other people. And then the next year, win another 2 and train them. And at first it looks fairly moderate, but after just a few years, it starts to go exponential. And that you can win more people to Christ by a ministry of multiplication than you can of a ministry of addition. You don't just add to the church, you multiply the church when you do evangelism explosion. And so he taught us the skills for personal evangelism, gave a vision of lifestyle evangelism, always having gospel tracts in your pocket, always having points of contact, having gospel conversations as you go about your daily business with your neighbors, friends, family, and so on. So EE was tremendous. The first missionary who came past my church was Francis Grimm. Francis Grimm had been at his father's deathbed in hospital and had seen that the nurses were phenomenal and they really did care physically for his father and the other patients very well. But he was struck by the fact that where's the spiritual care? And he started Hospital Christian Fellowship as a result, that what you need to do is win medical personnel to the Lord. Not just doctors and nurses, but also the pharmacists and all the other orderlies they've got in any hospital. Train them in Bible studies, give them evangelistic and discipleship skills so that they can minister to the spiritual needs of the patients and especially to the family members who might be losing people in the hospital. So this is the first missionary to come past our church. I ran to the front afterwards and joined his mission. So my first mission was Hospital Christian Fellowship. And they taught me to pray. They had days of prayer, they had nights of prayer. It started every morning with prayer. Every lunchtime at half an hour of prayer after lunch. There was praying through Operation Board, so many good things. And that's where I met Brother Andrew. Brother Andrew of God Smuggler fame was a good friend of Francis Grimm, and he came and visited and spoke at devotion sometimes. And so that also worked into my mind about Bible smuggling and all of that sort of thing. So Francis Grimm did a phenomenally important work in my life, taught me to live by faith as well. And so when I came out of the military, I bought this motorbike and started the motorbike mission, which later evolved into Frontline Fellowship. But in between was the army, military corps, where this is what they call a fuss plate, tires and drums and poles and 8.4 kilometers. Teamwork. And 6 South African Infantry battalion parade. And we could run as one. It was like one long chameleon. And we could look smart as well as get dirty and do what's got to be done. But 6 South African Infantry, Grahamstown, we organized evangelistic crusades. I was fine in the army because I only feared God and Francis Grimm by that stage. And so I wasn't afraid of the corporal and the sergeants. And that's where Frontline Fellowship began. Had all-night Bible study and prayer meetings, and were able to organize Operation World prayer vigils where we'd pray through the night. And that's how I got my vision for Mozambique and Angola. And up at the border, we had Bible study and prayer meetings in every base that we were in. And of course, some nights we would have been on operations or duties, ambush drills and so on. But every night we were in base, we had Bible study and prayer meetings. And this was home for a long time. Coffee bars, outreaches, evangelism. I still meet soldiers who came to Christ there. I meet them all over the place. Even now, going up to KwaZulu-Natal, I had people coming up to me saying, you know, my brother came to Christ through one of your outreaches. I was in the army and I heard you, and so many people. And this man here was once our enemy. Zhao was trained in Patrice Lumumba University in Moscow. Shangan man, trained to be a terrorist for Frelimo, became one of our evangelists in Mozambique. And Frontline Fellowship developed over 40 years ago. This, interestingly, is our first 3 peaks. So Frontline camps then, we ran up Devil's Peak, Tabe Mountain, Lion's Head, ended on Signal Hill. These are the first 4 to come in. John Michael Tours, this recce in the middle. He's still in that case. He's absolutely, totally bossies. When we went up the border, people said, John Michael Tours, a Christian? No way. He used to bite the tops of beer bottles, chew the glass and drink out the jagged edge. And he's completely and utterly insane. He's still going into Middle East as a mercenary these days, or what they're called, a civilian contractor. And he looks like a American soldier, and this chap was a Bushman's Battalion 202 Battalion character. He had been with the Bushmen tracking terrorists up in Southwest Africa. He's a pastor now in Kaz, a pastor in Namibia. These are the rest of the team. Some of them did, I think, the 12 peaks. Some got lost on Tabe Mountain before they got there. We were so fast, John Michael Tours got in at 6 hours and 12 minutes. That's Devil's Peak, Tabe Mountain, Lion's Head, to Signal Hill. And so I got in third. I was, 6 hours and 20 minutes, something like that. And Lenora was meant to have the food and water waiting at the other end because we couldn't carry kits of food and water and so on. So we were absolutely finished by the time we got there. And she got there hours later because she never thought we could get there that quick, being a phys ed teacher. But South African Army has a higher standard of fitness, I think, than what they used to have in America. So all of us were ex-Army of one sort. George here, who's now working for Open Doors, I recruited him at infantry school, and yeah, they all got a different story. This chap's a vet now, cares for animals, great chap. So my first mission was Mozambique. After that there was Angola, Sudan, and the whole story is given in the front line behind Enemy Lines for Christ, but all began back on the 3rd of April 1977. So for my 65th birthday, climbed Table Mountain. So I believe that we shouldn't let age stop us. If Caleb could say, give me that mountain, that's the attitude we should have.